before we get started today, I just want to say that I was preparing for this class, and we're going to talk about CHAMETZ today. We've been talking about CHAMETZ now for weeks, and it turns out to be a rich subject. That's a pun intended. And so I post these things on Facebook just to let people know we're having class today, and I look for a picture just so it'll be a little more apparent. And I found a picture, and this is our last class on CHAMETZ. So I found a picture of a bunch of bread that had been just burnt to a crisp, just totally annihilated, like, just ashes. And I put it in the Facebook post, and I was about to post it. And then I thought, oh, I can't post this because the picture of this burnt bread reminds me of the headline news today that's coming in my feed as a Jewish community member of this Palestinian village, Huwara, that was burnt to a crisp. The pictures literally looked the same. It's like this bread that was torched to ashes, and the pictures of these buildings and cars that were torched to ashes by Israeli terrorists. I mean, I don't want to use the word settler. I hate that it's always Israeli settlers, as if like the settlers are all one. Israeli terrorists. Really horrifying scene. And I'm not the political Rabbi Eddie Carr. I don't usually comment on world events, but here I am just trying to post about CHAMETZ on Facebook, and it's like I can't help but see that association. And it is true that this massacre was a response to the murder of two Israelis by Palestinian terrorists. So, and that's also a monstrous act. But that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. I mean, we have such explicit precedents for just that sort of thinking, right? Like that goes back to Genesis, right? Dinah was raped, and that's a horrifying thing. And so her brothers went and slaughtered everybody in the rapist's town. And Jacob was angry at them, Achartamoti, he said, you've made me despicable. You've made me ugly. La visheni. You've embarrassed me. Which sometimes we read as like, oh, why aren't you more concerned with your daughter's welfare? But what he's tuned into is like, yeah, that was horrifying. You don't go and massacre an entire village because of it. That's not Arura Pam, he says. Cursed is your anger. Cursed is your anger. Because you used Klei Hamas. You used tools of violence and lawlessness. That's not our way. That's not who we are. It's just not, that's not our people. Obviously these are some of our people, and there are monstrous people on both sides of this just interminable conflict. But today we should be ashamed. Today we should be ashamed. Yesterday we could have been angry at the murder that was done to us, but today we should really be ashamed, because that's it's just not. It's what's called a chilul Hashem, a desecration of God's name. To do this in the I saw a video of people praying at the flames, like saying the evening prayer together. That's a desecration of God's name. So I just want to name that as something that is, came across my calculus today as I was trying to post on Facebook about freaking CHAMETZ, and we're going to be talking about exile and oppression and all these things. So again, it's not my way to give a full-scale commentary on world affairs, but our tradition has all kinds of precedent and wisdom and thinking that should guard us against this kind of Hamas, lawlessness, not Hamas, the Palestinian organization. That's a Hebrew word, Hamas. and it means violent lawlessness, and it is a curse on our people, a curse on our people. So may our Torah today be Torah. Just remind us that we're people of Torah and principles and ethics and values and beliefs, and that we're here to sanctify God's name and not desecrate it. Okay, so we'll say a blessing and we'll get into Torah today. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. All right, let's get into Torah. Nothing can keep us from Torah, and we got sort of this is a long and protracted discussion of CHAMETZ, of the significance of CHAMETZ. This is our 5th class now on CHAMETZ, and that tells you, wow, what a subject. This has a lot. This idea, this symbol has a lot to teach us. And I tried to kind of wrap it all up last time, but the piece I brought at the end was so rich and so complicated that we just started to get into it. And I realized, wait a minute, I'm not going to just scramble through this at the end. Let's just break, and we'll do this as a final session here. This is a little bit of a treat. We've done a lot of the serious learning around CHAMETZ. We did, the various stages in the process of bedikat CHAMETZ, searching for CHAMETZ, biur CHAMETZ, destroying CHAMETZ. And then we started taking a look at lists of, well, what do you need to destroy? What counts as CHAMETZ? And that's kind of how we got into our subject it was actually 2 weeks ago. We took the day off for President's Day. So here's our, let me just remind you where we've been. Here's our source sheet from last time's and for today. And we're going to spend most of our time today with the Maaseh Rokeach. I spent a lot of time introducing him last time, but it was just at the end, and then we were out of time. It wasn't well timed. So I'm going to introduce him again, and then we're going to get into this very unusual and cool and fascinating Kabbalistic commentary on the Mishnah. And it was the only I turned to Kabbalah because it was the only source I had to process and reflect on this very strange Mishnah that we started with last time. So I'll just remind you of where we were at last time. So we were getting these lists of things that are CHAMETZ, and we first looked at the list of the 5 grains that either could make matzah or would count as CHAMETZ, and they were wheat, barley, spelt, rye, and oats. So that's one of the things the Mishnah teaches us. And then as we're starting to make lists, we make lists of other things that are forbidden on Passover, of things that have CHAMETZ. And then we noticed it's like not explicit that there's something going on here, but this is where we started last week. I said there's kind of a clue in this Mishnah in the 3rd chapter of Mishnah Pesachim, and the little kind of hint or clue to us once we read it through, we got pretty quickly, because possessing these things, you have to destroy these things. Remember, biur CHAMETZ is the removal or destruction of CHAMETZ from the world. For possessing these things, one transgresses the prohibitions of CHAMETZ on Passover. And then take a look at the origins of these items. Babylonian kutach, a dip with sharp flavor that contains flour. Persian beer. Edomite, that is Roman vinegar. And Egyptian zaytom, which is some other type of mead or beer. And then there were other things that were forbidden on Passover, including cosmetics. But fine, there's a list there, but you could see the first 4 items. Wait, what? This is not insignificant. Babylon, Persia, Rome, Egypt, right? So Babylon, Persia, Rome, Egypt. Those are, that's interesting, right? Those are very important places for our people's history. And in fact, those 4 places are places that are actually kingdoms that we think of as having subjugated us and driven us into exile, right? Egypt obviously is our origin story, but Babylon is the first exile. There's the Persian kingdom that oppressed us. That's the story of Purim that's coming up. And then the rabbis see the Roman conquest, which is the second destruction of the temple, as ongoing. Like, we're still in the Roman exile, or are we now? Maybe when we regained sovereignty in the land of Israel, maybe that exile ended. There's like some sort of the different ways to interpret history. But the Roman exile was thought to just be interminable. It lasted from the year 70 of the Common Era until we're still in it in the 20th century, right? So that'll be important, that the Roman exile never seems to end. That should just set off alarm bells when you see those four names. And so I tried to set them off for us. And I pointed out that we'll see these four names in lots of places. Here's a midrash in the beginning of the Torah that mentions four exiles, the Babylonian, Persian, and interestingly, instead of Egyptian, because is Egypt really an exile? Or is it just like the origin story? They speak instead of the Greek exile, and then the exile of the wicked kingdom, and that's Rome. So you can see this idea. There are four exiles. There are four great kingdoms. That there are four forces of oppression that we have to deal with. And the lists could be slightly different, Greek instead of Egyptian. But the point is, this Mishnah is doing something like hinting to us that there's a message here about, as we think of CHAMETZ, think also of these kingdoms of exile, okay? So what do we do with that? How do we make sense of that? And for that, we turn to this really interesting figure, the Maaseh Rokeach. The Maaseh Rokeach, which takes its name from this verse in Exodus, the perfumer's recipe. The perfumer's recipe. Now, that's a cool name. I'll just introduce him one more time before we take a look. The Maaseh Rokeach, the perfumer. Now, the perfumer is like the master of the spices in the temple, because there were ketoret, there were spice offerings. So someone had to know exactly how to create the right spices. And it's a great name for a Kabbalist, the Rokeach, right? Like the alchemist, you could say, right? Like the one who comes up with all of the secret formulas that will create some mysterious, intangible scent or spirit of awakening, right? So that's part of why they're playing with that language. The Rokeach that we're talking about here is a last name. His name is Elazar Rokeach, and he was a rabbi in the 1600s. In various appointments, he was the rabbi in Amsterdam, and then eventually moved to the Holy Land. And there, he had a very contentious life. He sort of like engaged in a lot of polemics with the Ramchal, with the followers of Shabtai Tzvi. So like you know how it is, like when mystics fight, you know, like there's like various mystical groups, and some are saying you're illegitimate, and anyway. He was embroiled in all kinds of conflicts, but he was a great scholar and wrote, for our purposes, what's important. He wrote this really incredible commentary on the Mishnah that is Kabbalistic in its approach. And we'll see that today. We started to scratch a little bit on the surface of it last time, but we'll see it today. I just want you to get prepared for some wild forms of interpretation. And wild, not just because they are wild, but because we are used to seeing wild interpretations of stories, of the stories in the Torah or in the Talmud that are clearly like allegorical, have some sort of symbolic meaning. You know, you could give me a Kabbalistic interpretation of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and I wouldn't be surprised. But you're going to give me a Kabbalistic interpretation of the Mishnah that lists what foods to eat or not eat. Okay, so it's like I sort of discovered this text. I'd never really studied it before. I studied it in just preparing for this class, and I was just totally titillated by it. It's wild and cool, and most importantly, it does some important work for thinking through what's going on here in this little clue, this little code that's in our Mishnah. Okay, so let's take a look. And I'm going to try, because it is so dense, I'm going to try to kind of read through it, unpack it, and then we'll stop and try to address some of the major questions that this Mishnah is raising. And again, what we're trying to do is understand, why does the list of forbidden items on Passover not just include items that have a trace of chametz in them, but go out of its way to name four origins of great oppression in our people's history. Okay, so let's take a look now at the Maseh Rokeach and how he gets into this. So he asks the question that we've just been asking, which is, okay, now we're going to explain the Mishnah of through these things one transgresses on Passover, meaning even if there's a trace amount like in beer or dip or whatever, cosmetics, you still have to get rid of these for Passover. These things must be removed from the world. And these are the things: Babylonian kutach, Median beer. Again, Madi or Madai is sort of like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Persian Median Empire, right? They were sort of two regions that were together. And so Persia, Babylon, Persia, Edomite, which again is the Hebrew kind of associated word with Rome, and then Egyptian Zetum. Babylon, Persia, Rome, Egypt. This seems very strange, he says, because if it's supposed to teach us that chametz is in a mixture must be removed from the world, why do we need to consider all these examples? Wouldn't one or two suffice? So that's another way of asking the question, like, why am I getting these four very distinct examples? He hasn't named that they are distinct in the way that we did, but he's just saying we don't even need four examples. So what's going on here? Therefore, it seems to me that the Mishnah is trying to teach us, and he says, it seems to me, the phrase is nira le'aniut dati, which means it seems to my humble mind. So he's like saying that this is like, I hear a hint here. Like I'm not sure about this, but I think that there's something going on here. That the Mishnah is trying to teach us with all its precise language that all of our redemptions came about on Passover. Okay, that's going to be a big point for him. All of our redemptions came about on Passover, and that's going to mean something to him. So let's start thinking about that. And so the future redemption will also be on Passover, and then all the husks will be removed from the world. All right, let me spend 1 minute talking about this word husks, because this is where we ended last time, and I started talking about husks, and I realized, oh my gosh, I'm near the end of my hour. I have to explain this like very strange Kabbalistic term, and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm not doing this justice. The husks. What are the husks? So this is, and I don't totally understand it, but it's a term that is used in the Kabbalah of the Arizal, that is the mysticism of the great mystic of our tradition, the 16th century thinker that we refer to as the Arizal, Yitzchak Luria. And he spoke about how there are these there's hidden light in the world. And he used various images for uncovering the hidden light in the world, which is sort of our mission, the divine light of creation. But it's not so obvious, it's concealed. And he uses various metaphors for that, broken vessels, things like that. But one of the metaphors he uses is that there are husks. And just like a grain has a husk, right? Or like a plant has a husk, and you have to uncover the husk, disregard the husk. Those are klipot, like you shell something, or like you kind of, I don't know what husking wheat, I don't know what the verb is, but you get the grain from out of the dross, right? So you get rid of a dross is like a wine term, right? So I'm not using the right terminology, but the husks of a grain, you get rid of that, you don't eat that, and you save the grain in the middle. Interesting, right? That we're talking about grains and how we use grains. So it's sort of playing with that as well. But the idea is you have to get rid of that which is hiding the truth, which is obscuring, which is not useful, and get to the essence, the hidden light within something. Okay, so that's I don't want to explain it too much more than that. I can't, but just that's sort of the general sense of what we're up to here. We're trying to discover some spiritual truth, some spiritual light. And in order to do so, we have to rid the world of something. And the word for that is husks. Okay, now let's see how that's done. Okay, Babylonian kutach refers to the Babylonian exile. Okay, that much we guessed. And it is known, I did not know this, but apparently this is known, that Belshazzar, one of the generals of Babylon, was killed on Passover Eve. And with that, all the klipot, all the husks of Babylon were gone, and Israel were then redeemed through Cyrus. Maybe Belshazzar was the leader before Cyrus. I forget how that goes. Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, Cyrus. I think Belshazzar was a general. Does someone else remember? I don't remember. But the point is, the Babylonian conquest ended with the death of Belshazzar, and that was on Passover. So remember what he's going to try and do is say Passover is the holding place for all exile. And so if you're in the Babylonian exile and Passover comes around, just know you're in a moment of redemption. Something could happen here. And indeed it did. Belshazzar died on Erev Pesach, on Passover Eve. Okay, let's go through the other examples here, this complicated stuff. And we're not going to add up all the numbers, but one of the tools they use in Jewish mysticism is gematria, which means adding up the numerical value of each of the letters, gematria. This is related to the Greek word for geometry, right? There's some kind of figuring there. Okay, if one adds up its gematria, Median beer, the phrase Median beer, so I've just bolded that for you. If you add up all of the letters in Median beer, so for example, the letter Shin counts for 300, the letter Kaf counts for 20, and the letter Resh counts for 200. Okay, so you add that all up, and you will get a number that is equivalent to the number that you would get from the phrase, "Cursed is Haman, woe unto his sons, for their downfall was also on Passover." Okay, now the move here, like a lot of folks don't have patience for this kind of Kabbalistic figuring, and it seems especially strained here. Is like he comes up with the phrase "Arur Haman oy labanav," cursed is Haman, woe to his sons. It sort of seems like he's like, well, I can figure out a sentence that has that amount in it. If you add up Medi and Beer, it equals cursed is Haman, woe to his sons. It sort of feels like a game, right? But it's good to know that this game is in our tradition. So hopefully, you have some sense of it or learning about it here. But we're not going to spend too much time with the actual gematria. Just note what he's doing here. On Passover, Babylonian conquest ended. On Passover, the Persian conquest ended with the death of Haman. Then he does an interesting thing. And he says, these are the redemptions from Babylon and Media, that is Persia, but Greece is not included because their downfall was not on Passover, right? It was on Hanukkah, like famously. Now, that's just I want to come back to that. That's an interesting move because remember, the earlier list of 4 exiles had Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. And this one takes Greece out and puts Egypt in. And I actually think that's a better list, but I want us to think about that. Why is Greece not on this list? Why is the Hanukkah story not fit in to the Passover arc, but the Purim story and the Babylon story does? Okay, so Greece is not in this list. Now let's see a little more gematria. After that comes Edomite vinegar. And if you add up all its letters, of all the letters of CHAMETZ HaAdomi, and not only that, you have to take into account a special system of gematria, which has the Tzadi Sofit, this letter here. It doesn't really matter if you know Hebrew so well, but what they're talking about is this letter here, Hatzadi Sofit. He's saying these letters that are written differently because they're at the end of the word, they have special numerical values. The value of that one is 900, which is not, you usually don't play with the values of letters of special, just differences in the way that we write letters. And I realize now I'm starting to say something that's so esoteric and dense that you may not be following. So don't worry if you're not, but just know that like they're getting into how do you get the right addition so that you can get to, and what do you get to? It comes to the same as the annihilation of Samael, the guardian angel of Edom / Rome. Bitul Sam Sar Shel Edom, who will be annihilated from the world on Passover in the future. Remember, Rome, they felt the Roman conquest had not ended. Sorry, I'm right here. And so Rome will be annihilated in the future. And you can note that by adding up the letters, and it ends to the annihilation of the guardian angel of Edom, whose name is, it's like, this is sort of like, you either have love and patience for this kind of Kabbalistic interpretation, or you don't. But you at least see what he's trying to do here. 1, 2, 3, they all took place on Passover. And one will take place on the Passover to come. And then one last move before I invite you in to think about what's going on here. One last move is, and the most interesting, is the Egyptian exile. Or is the Egyptian exile, were we exiled into Egypt? But we were in Jacob and his sons were in the land of Canaan, and then they went down to Egypt, and then they came back. Was that an exile? It's not always on the list, but here it is. And after all, we're talking about CHAMETZ, so we're thinking about Egypt and Passover. And here's what he says about Egypt and Passover. And the Mishnah has placed the Egyptian exile at the end. Now, this is interesting. He notes that in our original list, Egyptian Zaytum was the last item on the list, whereas you would have expected it to be the first item on the list because the other exiles proceed in chronological order: Babylon, Persia, Rome. So Egypt should be first, but instead it's last. Okay, why is that so? And he's going to see great significance in every phrase of our sages. And so the Mishnah is written in a way that is encoded with deep spiritual meaning. That's the Kabbalistic kind of assumption. Everything has deep spiritual meaning. Okay, so the Mishnah has placed the Egyptian exile at the end, for it is known that if the Egyptian exile had been 400 years, as it was foretold in the covenant between the pieces, then it would have been a complete redemption, and there would not have been any other exile. All right, let me explain that. God spoke to Abraham early on in Genesis and said, your children are going to go down to Egypt. They'll be enslaved for 400 years, and then they'll go free. So that was all predicted. Problem is, we weren't in Egypt for 400 years. We were in Egypt for like 210 years. So what's going on? The numbers don't make sense. So, but he's got an answer for this here. Okay, so we were supposed to be there for 400 years. So we didn't actually do all our time in Egypt. This is sort of a strange and like unpleasant notion. We didn't fulfill our exile in Egypt, but it works for him in order to make this claim. But because they were so immersed in Egypt in the 49 gates of impurity, Egypt was such a wretched, demoralizing, degrading state of existence, they just could not have stayed there any longer without being corrupted beyond repair. There's only so long that slavery can go on before you're completely broken. So God, in God's mercy, took them out before their time. Okay, that's a presumption. And so, based on that presumption, all the other exiles are completions of the Egyptian exile. So there's 400 years of exile total. These are all part of that accounting. And that means the Egyptian exile will not be over until the final redemption. And that is why we say that even in the days of the Messiah, we will still mention leaving Egypt, though our focus will have shifted to the oppressions of the ruling powers in those days. Okay, we're going to spend a lot of time, the rest of our time really, just thinking about mostly this idea. Or let's start here. All the other exiles are completions of the Egyptian exile. Extensions, completions, fulfillments related to the Egyptian exile. And that means the Egyptian exile continues until the final redemption, the Messianic time. And that's why we always remember Egypt. Even when the Messiah comes, we'll still say, remember when we left Egypt. But we won't be thinking about Egypt anymore. We'll be thinking about other oppressions that we've gone through. But Egypt will be the kind of framework or the paradigm or the category for thinking about that. Okay, just take a big breath. Okay, so it was like half the class just to explain, just to get through the text that we ended on last time. Okay, so now what's going on here? I want to hear your thinking about what it means, everything we've just said. But in maybe a way of getting into it is asking the questions about Greece and Egypt, because these are all the exiles, and part of what he claims is that all the exiles end on Passover, except he says for Greece, the Hanukkah story is different than all of our other conquest stories. So let's maybe start there. Maybe we can start to understand what he's talking about by trying to understand, why is he saying Greece is not a part of this thinking, and all of these other exiles are a part of this Passover thinking? What is different? What is the distinction between, say, Passover and the Passover story, and then Hanukkah and the Hanukkah story? Why is Greece not a part of this reckoning? Okay, I know this is complicated text, complicated questions, but maybe we can start to get into it now. So thank you, Yael, for leading us forward.
Well, the difference that jumps out at me is that in the Hanukkah story, we converted that which had been defiled, and in the other stories, we left that which was defiling.
Good. Okay, that's a great first pass here. It's like Hanukkah, it seems like they came in, they defiled our temple, and then we repurified it right there. Whereas the other exiles, the stories about like whatever the site of destruction was, we leave that site. Okay, and we leave the destruction behind. That's different. Okay, good. Let's see. Did I see Hal coming in? No. Okay, so that's good. And that, what Yael says, taps us into, yes, there is something very different about the Greek battle. And actually, I always found it a little funny that it appears on the other list, because it's not really an exile. It's not really an exile. It's not galut, right? It is true that we were oppressed and afraid of invading Greek armies, but they were invading into our land, which we never got fully kicked out of, and we claimed and we stayed. No, they never took us. We never went into exile. Okay, so that's a different story, and it's also different because the Greek story is also obviously different, because the whole point of the Greek story was that we wanted to be Greek, or at least some of us did. It wasn't like some kingdom coming down and squashing our peoplehood. It was a battle between two factions, one of whom wanted to be mityavnim, to become Hellenized, and one of whom did not. So that's an important story. We have a holiday for that story, but that's like different than this thinking that we're doing about Passover and other subsequent exiles, which were about like leaving it behind, fleeing, getting rid of the CHAMETZ, which lingers, right? Like just to sort of like link some of these symbols together in a as yet still kind of unclear way. But let's see if Leah can pick up on this. Leah Matsui.
I don't know if anyway, there seems to be something about mixture and purity. And Rabbi, what you spoke about just a few seconds ago, in Greece, we got very mixed into Greek culture. We got very assimilated. And it was hard, I think, to separate that assimilation, to bring it back somehow. But the other things are talking about substances that we're trying to keep pure from chametz, and those which we cannot somehow siphon off in order to recover their purity.
Good. Okay. I like the way you described that, Leah, because there is something about the Greek story, the Hanukkah story, that you might see that as a natural, as naturally able to borrow this same metaphor, right? Like assimilation, isn't it about like kind of getting all mixed up? And like this whole Mishnah is talking about the mixture of chametz into some other thing. Like you could borrow that same language, and yet there is something distinct about the Greek story. We've started to name it already, and I think if we're talking about these admixtures, one thing we can say is that even to this day, our relationship to Greek culture as a civilization is complicated. We kind of like Greek culture. We admire it, we respect it, and yet we don't want to be overcome by it. Part of the Hanukkah story is dealing with the mixture and trying to maintain our identity in spite of cultural influences, which are nevertheless, right? The Talmud says that the Torah can only be written in Hebrew or Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek. It's like, what? Like there's something about Greek. So it's a different story. Whereas these stories, Babylon, Persia, there's the feeling like, get rid of it. They really tried to destroy us. They really annihilate, get rid of that, all traces of that Egyptian kind of chametz, which is the chametz of slavery, of oppression. It's not the chametz of assimilation. It's different. Okay. So that's a good first start. Let's take one more comment, and then we'll move to the what he says about Egypt. Okay, but still trying to think about the distinctions that are being made here. Jen?
Yeah, I mean, and maybe my historical understanding is a little off, but the Hanukkah story is about a civil war. We were killing each other. And to me, that seems like the exact opposite of what's happening in the Passover story, where we're becoming a people instead of ripping each other apart as a people. That feels really distinct from the other stories involved in this.
Good, exactly right, and that really gets to the heart of it. There is some great battle, and there are Greek forces looming out there that we're worried about, and there is a desecration but it's in an internal battle. It's a civil war. We say the Greeks, but we really mean the Syrian Greeks. And even if we say the Syrian Greeks, we're really talking about the Hellenized Jews who were fighting on behalf of the Syrian Greeks, who were allied with the Syrian Greeks. So it's an internal conflict, and that's different, right? Because what we're thinking about on Passover is not like our own internal wars, but the actual forces, the idea that one people could subjugate, annihilate, commit genocide against another people. Okay. So that's good. That's a good distinction. And now we have a little bit of a category to work with. Oh, so that's the archetype. And the idea here is that Egypt sets an archetype, and Babylon, Persia, and Rome replicate that archetype. Okay, now let's take a look at what he says. We're just reminders of what he said there about Egypt, because he said some very complicated things. He said that all of the other exiles are completions of the Egyptian exile. Okay, and he had some kind of narrative reason for that. And that means the Egyptian exile will not be over until the final redemption. Egypt lasts forever. And this is the point that I want us to consider. And that is why we say that even in the days of the Messiah, we will still mention leaving Egypt, though our focus will have shifted to the oppressions of the ruling powers in those days. Okay, so let's think about this for a second. Egypt never ends. Passover never ends. That's the idea. Like somehow these other exiles are hinted to in our Mishnah because we can see Passover through all of our exiles, right? All of our oppression. There was a pharaoh in Nazi Germany, right? Like you keep reading the Passover story into our history. And therefore, this is part of why we always remember Passover, is keep Passover in mind, okay? So here, he's saying something distinct about Egypt and the way that and Passover and CHAMETZ and the way that it should be the symbolic item that not only do we reckon with on Passover, and not only do we reckon with for our own spiritual lives when we think about the CHAMETZ in our hearts, but also there's something about Passover that should teach us about every trial, adversity of oppression that we have, not Greek, internal conflict, not assimilation, but that sort of brutal oppression by another kingdom. That Passover is our way of thinking about that. So let's hear a little bit. What do you think that means? How?
So, I mean, to use a lit crit term, it becomes the master narrative for our people. I mean, and there's a double entendre there, since the master narrative is all about slavery, but it becomes the frame through which we interpret our history. And, I mean, we're kicked out of Spain, we're, massacred in Central and Eastern Europe, et cetera, but it is all seen, or it's all sort of articulated through this lens of the formative experience, really, in our history. So
good. I love that language, the master narrative, and you're right about the bit of wordplay there, double entendre there. That's right. And so, like, we read Passover, as I was just saying, into our history. It guides us through our history. It is a way of understanding our whole journey. And therefore, I'm just adding to what Hal said, and therefore we can go back to the Mishnah and see, oh, we're always looking for CHAMETZ. And when you're in Babylon, look for those traces of Egypt and Pharaoh in Babylon. You will understand Babylon better, right? When we are about to celebrate Purim next week, but don't forget Passover. When you're in Purim, think about Passover, because those stories are connected, right? And here we are in exile in the diaspora. Passover is always with us. We're in the Roman exile. There's a continuing awareness of, and that's why I say, and I allude to Nazi Germany. It's like we keep Passover with us as a way of understanding something in the world, and therefore on Passover, we're not just looking for the CHAMETZ of Egypt. We're looking for the CHAMETZ of Germany and of Persia and of Rome and of all of those stories of oppression. We're looking for that. Spain, the Spanish expulsion, there's a trace of Passover in that, right? So look for that. And that becomes part of why the Mishnah is encouraging us to seek out all traces of CHAMETZ, not just explicit CHAMETZ, but the idea of a trace of CHAMETZ is now a symbol in itself. It's not Egypt, it's a trace of Egypt. Yeah? Okay. Matt?
Yes,
Yeah.
okay. I'm again going to go back to, critical, higher criticism of the Torah, which says that the Passover story was written to get us over the Babylonian exile. And given that, as an actual master narrative created for our people, it worked. It did the job. I think without this core, story that we were given, we wouldn't have survived. We would have changed. The world is filled with people who have been removed from their place of origin and become different. They've assimilated, they've changed, people who left, Persia 300 years ago aren't talking about themselves as Persians. They're, French, they're whatever. We still talk of ourselves as Jews because this master narrative worked. It created our sense of who we are, that we could come back.
Okay, great. All right, that's powerfully put. Matt, as usual, reading this historically different than I would, right? Where Matt is saying the Passover story written as a response to the Babylonian exile, whereas I would see the Passover story as preceding, right? The history which informs, and that's the way our texts are reading it as well. But it doesn't matter, because Matt's point is still so strong that this story has a kind of power. It works as a master story. You can't just pick any story to be a master story. There's something about Exodus, whether written before or after, it says it. It says it in stark language, in symbolic language. It gives us a kind of a form or an arc that we can use to understand Babylon, to understand why do these things keep happening to us, to other people in the world? Why does this continue? Study that Passover story. Study the book of Exodus. You have been given a kind of a code to understand a cycle in history that must be broken, right? That's the idea. Ultimately, in the final redemption, we will and that's the power of saying, as the Maseh Rokeach does, it's not over yet. We're still in the Passover story. The Passover story is the story of our whole history, of the world's whole history. And when we are redeemed from oppression as a whole world, as when we get to that Messianic era, which is like an era of universal peace, then the Passover, the Egyptian exile will be over, right? So that helps explain why we don't usually see the Egyptian exile on the list, because it's not, is it really an exile? It's more like the origin story. But with this kind of framing, it makes perfect sense. We're in the Egyptian exile. We've always been in the Egyptian exile because every exile is the Egyptian exile. Right? This is like a very cryptic text that suddenly provides us with like a really powerful way to think of Passover as, just keep using Hal's words, which are best, our master story, and indeed it is our master story. All right, let's hear from a couple of other folks, and then we'll look at one last text. So let's first hear from Kathy.
There. So yeah, I love this about the master narrative, and this is really pulling together some important points. But my question is about the role of chametz. So what I don't get in terms of the importance of chametz during Passover is that the whole rest of the year we eat chametz all the time. It's like chametz is not a bad thing. I mean, we eat it, and we're supposed, it's fine to eat it the whole rest of the year. And so how does that work in terms of it being the symbol of all of these oppressions? Or although it is also true that we don't go around calling it chametz the rest of the year. It's not like we say, oh, let's serve some chametz, I mean, so I don't know, is it not chametz the rest of the year? I don't get that.
Okay, that's a great question. And you gave already a great answer. It's sort of an interesting thought that like, there's no such thing as chametz in December, right? Chametz is the state of leavened bread during the Passover time. And that is definitely part of the answer. Part of the answer is and the Maseh Rokeach is playing with this as well, that it's at this time. It's not just that psychologically, this is a good story to use to think about history, but actually, I mean, he's a mystic, right? So he believes that, no, there's real truth to the idea. This season, this Passover, the week of Passover is a time when we can see a portal of redemption opening up. And so it's on Passover, during that time that chametz is so significant, because that is a time when we might pray for, expect, yearn for our current redemptions to be to come to an end. And that's what he sees happening through all. And he promises us that the ultimate redemption, when the Messiah comes, if you're betting, you probably want to pick, the month of April. Messiah is probably going to come in April, right? Because it's like, that's the idea, is that it ends in Passover. So time is significant in this way. And then I'll just say the other obvious thing here, which is that, the object, we've been saying this all along, but the object of chametz, we've been wondering, is the problem that it is toxic? It's a like kryptonite substance, in which case, why do we ever eat it? Or is it that we in this tradition use a device, a symbol, an object, a food as a way of evoking a spiritual, psychological consciousness? And I tend to come down on that side. Chametz is like, there's nothing wrong with bread. It's what bread represents, and it's what bread represents at that time, when bread was the thing that we had to leave behind, the thing that we had no time for, the thing that wasn't the most important thing in that moment. So yeah, there's a lot there, and you started to give us some good answers, but I think there are some important basic points about the role of ritual and time as devices for creating a spiritual awareness, not just talking about these spiritual things, but living them out in real time through ritualized substances. That's the tradition. Okay, Emily.
I was just going to add that I've been thinking about how on the Listedo, we always say that in every generation, we have to see ourselves as and our families as having been personally redeemed. And if we're still in Egypt, if every exile is Egypt, then indeed we are consistently being redeemed.
Exactly right. Exactly right, Emily. That's exactly right. And you're beginning to show us how this idea that's like hinted at in the Mishnah, that like you should see a trace of Egypt everywhere, or CHAMETZ everywhere. Actually, that's core to the Passover experience, right? B'chol dor v'dor, in every generation. I will tell you, I was watching the Biden State of the Union speech, but I didn't really watch the speech because those are pretty boring. But I did watch, I put on the YouTube video, and I just watched them shuffling into the room. I love that. Just there's no real audio. It's just like a buzz of like senators talking to each other. And it's just fascinating just watching them walk in. And then at a certain point, the first gentleman walks in, Doug Emhoff, and everybody greets him, and he comes in, apparently kissed Joe Biden on the lips, and everybody was scandalized by that. Like, it's like they said hello too friendly. So it's like, so that's, I'm watching this happen. And then I look to his left, he sits down, and there's an older woman there. It's my cousin Ruthie. My cousin Ruthie, who is in her 90s and who works at the Holocaust Museum in DC, and survived Auschwitz, was found hiding in an oven. And she was there as a guest of President Biden's because of the recent sort of spate of anti-Semitic attacks. My cousin Ruthie, I couldn't believe it. I was like, is that her? I paused the video, I went and looked it up. Ruth Cohen. It was like, she's an incredible woman, just an incredible woman. She's sitting there next to like Bono and Doug, you know what I mean? My cousin Ruthie. But I'm thinking of her when you say, Emily, that we have to remember in every generation that we're still leaving Egypt. My cousin Ruthie left Egypt. She left Nazi Germany, but she left Egypt, and she's standing there, right, next to like the people who run my country, right? We're still in this. We're still trying to get out of this, and it continues, right? So in every generation. Okay, I want to show you one last thing, and then I'll take a comment from Yael and whoever else has some final thoughts. But I just want to show you one last interesting reflection that the Maseh Rokeach. Remember, he said something kind of strange at the end. I don't know if it seems strange to you, but he sort of finished on an odd note, which is that even though in the days of the Messiah, we still mention leaving Egypt, that seems like the final point, right? Like, we'll always mention Egypt. That's what we've been talking about. But he says, our focus, though, will have shifted to the oppressions of the ruling powers in those days. Okay, what does he mean by that? Well, he says here, I didn't translate it, but he says, as it is explained in the last chapter of Masechet Brachot in the Talmud, and this is what he's referring to. So this is an idea, and I leave it as a final thought for your consideration. Ben Zoma said to the sages, will the exile from Egypt be mentioned in the days of the Messiah? Are we still going to be talking about Egypt in the days of the Messiah? Really? Doesn't it say in Jeremiah, behold, days are coming, says the Lord, that they will no longer say, the Lord lives who brought up the children out of the land of Egypt? We're not going to say that anymore. Instead, we'll say, as the Lord lives that brought up and let the seed of the house up out of the north country and from all of the countries where I had driven them. Okay, so you understand Ben Zoma's question? Eventually in history, our return from Babylon becomes much more important to us than our return from Egypt. Our return from America becomes much more important to us than our return from Egypt. Our return from Argentina, like, will we really still be talking about Egypt in those days? No, we'll have shifted to the liberation of our times. And the sages respond, and they say, no, no, no. They said to him, these verses do not mean that in the future, the exodus from Egypt will be uprooted from its place. Rather, that the subjugation of the kingdoms of those days will be primary, and the exodus from Egypt will be secondary. And that's where he ended as well. Our focus will have shifted to the oppression of the ruling powers in those days. So once again, we're out of time, but I'll just take one last comment from Yael. Maybe you'll speak to this or not, but I wonder what you all think of this idea that Egypt will always be with us, but it will become more important. It'll be primary to think about the oppression of this moment. Okay, Yael, do you want to offer a thought on that before we close?
Well, I'm thinking of not just the escaping or the redeeming, but of the insidious nature of the CHAMETZ of the cultures in which we live and how it seeps into us. And I think the alert is for us to always be conscious of this seeping, insidious cultural change that takes us away from our path. Know before whom you stand. And we always need to remind ourselves, this is who I am. And like Alenu, this is who I am. This is my job on earth. And it seeps in through our pores. And so we need to be very, very cautious.
Great. Okay, good. Thank you for bringing it back to the Mishnah, to the idea. The central principle was that anything with any trace of chametz, we have to be attentive to on Passover, because that's the idea. Remember to always keep a trace of Egypt with you. Always look for the Egypt in your times. Look, remember how the Passover story can teach us how to navigate our world. And so be sensitive to that and hope that on Passover, you gain new lessons and new understandings. You open new portals for redemption from the sufferings of this moment. That's what we're learning from this Mishnah. But what we learned from the Talmud and from that piece he's referring to is, yes, all of that is true, but we're not so mired in the Passover story that that's the only thing that matters. We have to be awake to the suffering of this moment, right? This is what really, we're gonna have to get ourselves out of this situation. We have to liberate ourselves from the oppressive forces of this time. And that's what's really most important. Passover will help us to do that if we open ourselves up to the lessons of the master story. So let's just close with a prayer that we never forget Passover. We never forget our history. We never forget the lessons of the exiles that we have escaped. But also let's not forget that the essential thing, the urgent thing, is the oppression and the sufferings of this moment. So let's attend to the sufferings of this moment. Is my prayer for us today. Okay, wishing you a good week. Next week, we will do a little Mishnah class on